Good afternoon, Year 6. Welcome to your history lesson. We are starting a new topic today all about the Vikings. So, what do you already know about the Vikings? Maybe you've watched horrible histories or read some books about them, or perhaps, if not, you could use this image to help you come up with some ideas about the Vikings. So, pause the video now, see if you can come up with some ideas about this picture, and then we'll go through some answers. Brilliant. So what I got from this picture is that the Vikings seem to be travelling in a really long, narrow wooden boat, and they also look like they're going across the sea. I can also see that lots of these Vikings are wearing some sort of armour, and part of that armour looks like a helmet with lots of big horns in it. And another part of it that they seem to have is a round shield that they're holding at the side of their boat. So lots of them have these round shields and they have different designs on them, but every single one of them is round. So we are going to watch a horrible histories clip about the Vikings. I'm hoping that this plays well enough for you to hear and watch it, but if not, I will put you a link to it on Teams so that you can go back and watch it from home and make some notes on it.
Hello and welcome to the news at when. When? Over 1,000 years ago, when Vikings were always invading British shores. Here to tell us all about it is Bob Hale with the Viking Report. Bob.
Thank you, Sam. Well, it's 786 AD and all calm at the moment, with lots of happy English people, or Saxons as I like to call them, spread across the whole country. But I'm afraid it's not going to last. You can see here a nasty Viking front sweeping in from the northeast, causing heavy damage to both monasteries and indeed monks, before heading back off to Scandinavia. But not for long. Here they come again, and this time there's lots more of them and they just won't go away. But luckily, a strong band of Saxons, led by King Alfred, pushed back up across the country, creating a front here, with the Saxons to the south and the Vikings to the north. But in 920 AD, the Saxons say, no, enough is enough, and they retake the north, making the whole of England Saxon again, and that is the end of that. Or so we thought. Here come those Vikings again. And a Saxon king called Ethelred doesn't like fighting, so he tries to pay them not to fight. But they just take his money and invade anyway, those Vikings. And before long, the Vikings are absolutely everywhere. And in 1017, we even get a Viking king. Let's call him Canute, because that's his name. And everyone just shuts up and gets used to it. But not for long. After a whole succession of kings, some Saxon, some Viking, we end up with a Saxon one again. Let's call him Harold, because that's his name. And before you know it, it's 1066. Sound familiar? Probably. Very famous. Vikings invade from the north. They want the crown. And while Harold's fighting them off, the Normans from France invade the south. They say the crown belongs to their king, William the Conqueror. There's a massive battle in Hastings. Let's call it the Battle of Hastings, because that's what it was called. And Harold gets shot in the eye and then cut into little pieces. Not a great day. Poor lad. However, William the Conqueror just conquers England, and all the Saxons who were so worried about the Vikings end up being conquered by the Normans. I mean, fancy that. So, in summary, lots of nasty men, big axes, just don't go outside. Back to you, Sam.
So, after looking at that, hopefully you managed to hear a few of the things that the person doing the news report was saying, but if not, and I picked out 4 questions that I wanted to answer from that video. So the where is my first question. And if you were listening carefully, it said that the Vikings came from Scandinavia, which today is split up into 3 different countries: Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And they invaded the UK or Britain from around the year 700 AD. So what did they do? They travelled across the sea on those long wooden boats that we talked about earlier, and they attacked or invaded and tried to get into our monasteries, which are like churches. When did they do that is our next question. Well done if you heard 786 AD, which was when the first proper invasion started. And then my last question is who? So the people that were involved were the Anglo-Saxons who were in Britain, and that was the period of time we were in, and the Vikings who were trying to invade our land. So Some more interesting facts then about the Vikings. We've already learned about where they come from. They came from Scandinavia. But something else that you might not know about them is that they spoke Norse, which is a language that had its own alphabet. And lots of the things that we've learned about Vikings were pieces of information or artifacts that actually had Norse writing on them. So we had to figure out what that meant before we understood more about the Vikings. The word Viking itself actually means a pirate raid in the Norse language. And this word raid that's here is a word that we're going to have a look at in the next couple of lessons. So maybe you want to have a think about if you know what that means ahead of that lesson. They sent armies to Britain sometime around 700 AD was the first time they came, and they intended on taking over some of our land. But they didn't actually properly invade and settle until 793 AD, so 93 years later, which is quite a long time. Even though they left a really long time ago and there's no Vikings left in Britain, they left a strong mark on our society. So some place names are still here because of the Vikings' influence. We have some artifacts, which we've looked at in our World War II topic, from the Vikings, and some words in our language are things that we still use from the Viking era. So for today's lesson, we are going to be trying to order significant events from the Viking era. And to do that, we're going to use our historical sources and evaluate the importance of the events, or what we think is most important and what we think is least important. And to do that, we need to use two different types of sources. So we've got our primary sources and our secondary sources that we've looked at in our World War II topic. So pause the video now and see if you can remember the difference between a primary and a secondary source. So a primary source then is a source of information that was actually there at the time. So well done if you wrote that. Maybe you gave us some examples of primary sources that you can think of. And a secondary source is a source of information that wasn't there at the time, so it's the opposite, or was created after the event had finished. So I'm going to try and go through some of the information that the man went through in the video with a little bit extra, and I've used a mixture of primary and secondary sources to find out this information. What I would like you to do is think about what the Vikings were actually like and why they did what they did, or why do you think they did what they did. So we are starting at 700 AD, which is the Anglo-Saxon period in Britain. And at this time, Britain was divided into four parts. So we've got Northumbria, which was in the north of Britain or England. We've got Mercia, which is sort of towards the middle or the west, but you need to remember that this area over here is Wales. We've got East Anglia, which is to the east, and Wessex, which is further south. Those are the four areas that England was split up into in that time. In 787 AD, a group of Vikings from Norway tried to attack the Isle of Portland in Dorset, so that's in Wessex on the south, and they were aiming to settle, trade or raid our land. Once they'd reached the Isle of Portland, so the coast, they were met by a royal reeve. Now that word reeve is a new word for us, and it's someone who is responsible for protecting our land from anyone or anything from a foreign country. But unfortunately, the Vikings killed him, and then they returned to Scandinavia. So in response to that, England started to defend Mercia, or that area, in order to protect it, because they thought that that might be the next place that the Vikings tried to invade. In 793 AD then, so about just under 10 years later, the Vikings attacked a monastery in Lindisfarne on the Northumbrian coast. So actually, instead of going to Mercia, they'd come to Northumbria, which is actually a lot closer to Scandinavia the Mercia where we thought they were going to attack. Lindisfarne is on a holy island, and it has a wealthy monastery because it has lots of money, land, and other treasures that the Vikings wanted. So that's why they chose to attack there. But it took the English people, the Anglo-Saxons, by surprise because they hadn't expected an attack on that coastline. They thought they were going to go to Mercia. So it wasn't very well protected. That meant that the Vikings could really quickly loot the monastery. So that's a word that we've come across in our Floodland book. So they looted it, which means they stole gold or anything of value. And they actually killed some of the monks who were religious people that were living there at the time. So I've put a couple of pictures on this slide. This one, with the sea around it, shows Holy Island and the monastery on the top. So you can see that it's surrounded by the sea, which means it's actually quite easy for the Vikings to get there. And this is what it looks like now when it's gone to ruin. So there's still parts of it left, but it's not what it used to look like. And there's a 9th century commemorative stone that we've got from Lindisfarne, which shows something called Doomsday. So do you think this is a primary or a secondary source? It's primary, well done. So moving on to 866 AD. So the Vikings at this point had settled at Lindisfarne, and people, particularly monks living in monasteries, were really worried that other attacks would happen. So far, we hadn't had any more in England. The Vikings had stayed where they were, but they had started to attack Scotland, which isn't too far away from Northumbria. So the Vikings have seen Britain as more of a place to colonise, which means that they want to stay there rather than just to raid it for what its treasures were. However, the Norse armies did invade York and they managed to capture it. And that's a major city in Northumbria because it's really big. And they established the Kingdom of Jorvik. So usually, if we were at school, we would have been able to go on a trip to somewhere called the Jorvik Centre. So in a moment, I'm going to take you on a virtual trip there and show you some of the things that they've got at the Jorvik Centre. But before we do that, this is a map that shows you all of the Viking invasions or attacks on Britain. It shows you where the ships came to and what year they came there. So you can see that there were 3 near Northumbria or in that sort of area. And Mercia, where they were trying to protect, there's actually only 2. There's a lot on the south coast as well, but that's quite a big area to cover, which might be why. So the Jorvik Centre is a museum in York, which is all about Vikings. They have lots of artifacts there that you can study, and they even have a ride which lets you experience some of the smells, sights and sounds that might have been similar to those in the Viking era. They also have an archaeological dig site where you can develop some of the skills that people use to find artifacts. So this picture down here on the left is the back of the ride that people go on in the museum, and it takes you through an imaginary village from the Vikings' time. And some of the things they show you are the materials that they built buildings from, clothing that they wore, and it also shows you some of the types of jobs that people had. This picture here are some of the artifacts that they've got at the Jorvik Centre. So lots of them are made out of silver because that's something that the Vikings thought was valuable. And then these things over here are other artifacts. So the Vikings actually made combs out of certain materials, so they were really clever, and they managed to make different objects from the things that they'd already got. They managed to make sorts of shoes, and with this one down here, you might recognise this as looking quite similar to the shape of some sort of shoe that people wear today. So have a think, see if you can recognise what that is. An ice skate, well done. And I think this is really interesting because the bit on the bottom is actually a horse bone. They managed to make ice skates by shaving down these bones so they were really smooth and shiny and they could skate along the ice. And they like to do that as a bit of a hobby. And then this bit here is part of the dig site. So it's a bit like a play area where children can use different tools to dig for things. Sometimes you uncover what buildings and villages used to look like. Other times it might be bones. Other times it might be something like this, like a comb, and things that the Vikings used. And it lets us find more out about the Vikings and understand what they used to do. So 878 AD, the Vikings started to attack further south, which we saw on that video, and they attempted to force their way into the area of Wessex. But at the time, King Alfred made his army of Saxons fight back, and they defeated the Vikings at something known as the Battle of Ethandune. And because of his success, King Alfred was known as Alfred the Great. So this meant that the Vikings were held in the north of England and the Saxons were in the south. So there was a bit of a boundary created, which was then known as Danelaw. This piece of information down here is a piece of writing in what looks like a different language. And it's called Alfred's dynasty. So it shows that the idea that those Vikings were trying to force their way into Wessex might have actually been slightly made up. So if you imagine somebody forcing their way in, and then you taking an army to fight back, if your army was successful, it makes you look really, really, really good, like a brilliant leader. And maybe that's what King Alfred did to make himself look better, and that might have been how he got his name, Alfred the Great. And that's another piece of primary information that somebody found, and they managed to find that out from translating it. So 954 AD. So the Viking kingdom, known as Jorvik, became part of England again. And the Viking armies from Denmark in 1994 attempted to raid London but were defeated. And this map up here has lots of little red dots on it. And it shows you the location of lots of rocks that look like this, and they are known as rune stones. So in the Scandinavian countries, there are lots of these sorts of stones with these markings on, and that is actually in the Norse language. So when we've managed to translate them, it shows us the location that the Vikings were trying to invade. So there's lots of these in Scandinavia, and you can actually see, or they recorded where they wanted to invade in England. So 1066, which is a really famous year. So on the 25th of September in 1066, the Battle of Stamford Bridge took place near York, and it was between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. They were led by Harold Hardrada. So the Vikings were led by this man called Harold, who tried to seize the English throne. Well, Harold was already the Norwegian king, so he was trying to take the English throne and become our king, but he was actually killed along with most of his men. And this picture shows the Battle of Stamford Bridge. So there's lots of people there fighting and trying to either protect or take and invade some land. Very soon after this, or less than a month in fact, because on the 14th of October in 1066, there was another attack in England, but it wasn't the Vikings, it was the Norman French army, which was led by William, who's now known, or was the Duke of Normandy. And he invaded the south of England and tried to conquer it as well. And that was known as the Battle of Hastings. So, because we'd just been attacked by the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons weren't really expecting another attack, and especially not from somebody different. And because we were so surprised by it and not prepared, William's army won, and the Normans began to rule in England then, and William became known as William the Conqueror because he'd been successful in conquering England. So your task for today is to log into Microsoft Teams and open your worksheet that should look like this. I would like you to pick 6 of those times that I've just been through and choose which ones you think are most significant or most important or had the biggest effect on England, and put them on your timeline in order. Okay, so you could go back through this video and pause it at points if you need to find out some information about what year something happened in, or what actually happened and who was involved, and then put it on your timeline. After you've done that, there are 2 questions for you to answer. The first one is, who were the Vikings? So in your own words, can you tell us who the Vikings were? You might want to tell us where they came from. And then your second question is, why do you think the Vikings chose to invade England? Once you've done that, make sure you've turned it in, and then you will have completed your first history lesson in this topic.